and very honored to have you among us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Naveen, and let me welcome everyone as well. It's a pleasure to see so many colleagues and students and members of the larger Middle East Studies community here. Today, it's really my pleasure to introduce Professor Nilay Özok-Gündoğan, who is an assistant professor of Ottoman and Middle East history at Florida State University. She is trained in political science as well as history, having an MA from Boğaziçi University and her PhD from Binghamton University. Her scholarship explores modern state-making, property regimes, and intercommunal conflict, as well as coexistence in the borderlands of modern empires. She has also written extensively about questions of methodology in Kurdish studies in particular. Her publications have appeared in a range of prominent journals, including the Journal of Social History, the International Journal of Middle East Studies, and Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Her current research and book manuscript provides a socio-historical analysis of the dissolution of the Kurdish principalities in the Ottoman Empire. And her research thus is really kind of at the junction of an interconnected histories of Ottoman, Kurdish, and Armenian communities. So it's a pleasure to have you with us today, Hoş geldiniz, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Hoş bulduk. Thank you so much for this generous introduction, Dr. Stolz. And I would like to thank the Middle East Studies program and also Naveen particularly for inviting me here today. And I lived in the Midwest quite a bit in Ohio, and now that I'm in Florida, I really miss the cold days and winter days of the Midwest. So on a hot summer day, having said that, in 2013, oops, no one reminded me to share my PowerPoint again. Okay. There it is. Yeah. On a hot summer day in 1840, so sorry, this wasn't a really good start, I guess. In the last days of August 1848, the inhabitants of Huashin, a village nestled in a secluded valley on the banks of the eastern Euphrates, woke before sunrise. The men met at the village mosque to perform the pre-sunrise prayer marking the beginning of Eid al-Fitr, a 3-day Muslim holiday celebrating the end of Ramadan. Just before the prayer began, they heard the sound of gunfire in the distance. As the noise approached, the prayer goers realized these were Abdullah Bey, the Hakim or the ruler of the Polo Emirate, and at least 600 armed men. They were coming to collect 1.5 tons of clarified butter from the villagers in payment for 4 years of back taxes they owed to Abdullah Bey. The villagers responded by opening fire. The Ramazan holiday turned bloody with 3 villagers dead and 4 wounded. The villagers then fled to the surrounding hills in despair. The next day, Abdullah Bey came back with his men and set the village on fire. 65 houses and buildings were burnt to the ground, along with store grain, animals, their fodder, poplar trees, and vineyards. So on the surface, this event just looks like any ordinary conflict in other agrarian societies all around the world at the time. In this case, too, the issue of taxation lay at the heart of the confrontation between Abdullah Bey and the villagers of Huashin. But neither Abdullah Bey nor the villagers did know at that point that this incident would trigger a series of events that would shatter the basis of the Kurdish Bey's hereditary rule in a very short time. Abdullah Bey was descendant of the Polo emirs, or begs in Kurdish, or beys, or mirs, who had been ruling the emirate for more than 3 centuries by then. Successive Ottoman sultans recognized the hereditary rulership of the Polo Beys over the emirate from the time they came under the Ottoman suzerainty in the 16th century. This violent encounter would cost Abdullah Bey his position as the Hakim, his land holdings, and finally his bond with his homeland in less than a year. For the Ottoman state exiled him to Tekfurdağı, today's Tekirdağ in Rumelia, 900 miles away from the lands that his ancestors ruled for centuries. It was not just Abdullah Bey's career, though. Weshin brought the end of an era, the era of the Kurdish Bey's hereditary rule in Polu. Kurdish emirates and the elite families have been the cornerstones of both popular and academic historical renditions of Kurds and Kurdistan. The prevalent belief in their significance and the curiosity towards their past, however, have only recently reflected on actual historical research. Besides, existing scholarly interest has inordinately been centered on the most powerful Kurdish ruling houses, namely the Baban, based in Süleymaniye, today's Iraq, Botan, based in Cizre, and Soran, based in Revandus. All of these disappeared from the political arena in the second half of the 19th century with Ottoman military campaigns. Of these, Bedirhan Bey of the Botan Emirates attracted the most attention in historical scholarship because his descendants constituted the leading cadres of the budding Kurdish nationalist movement at the turn of the 20th century. Abdullah Bey, who had this violent confrontation with Weshin village on that hot August day, was also a member of an elite Kurdish family who led the Palu Emirates. Compared to the aforementioned ruling houses, however, the Palu Emirate was geographically much smaller and politically less significant in the 19th century. Unlike the others mentioned, the Palu Beys did not lead large-scale uprisings in the second half of the 19th century in response to the Ottoman state centralization policies. It's true that just like the other emirs of these three formidable emirates, Ottoman Empire exiled Ottoman Abdullah Bey outside of Kurdistan in the 19th century, but the rest of the family stayed in their historic homeland with continuing claims to the rulership of the emirate for several decades after Abdullah Bey's exile. And contrary to Bedirhan Bey's descendants, or the Babans, who became the flag bearers of Kurdish nationalism in the 20th century, the majority of Palu Bey's descendants got integrated into mainstream Muslim Turkish identity. As such, the Palu Bey's modern history does not quite fit with the nationalist interpretations of the Kurdish past, in which the Kurdish ruling houses mostly represent heroic resistance to the Ottoman state, military and political encroachments in the long 19th century. So what attracted my interest toward the Palu Emirate was what happened in Weshin in 1848. Initially reading the archival documents on the event's aftermath, I was puzzled by the drastic consequences of this seemingly ordinary happening. The ensuing court case and Abdullah Bey's eventual exile involved a criminal investigation, as the event resulted in the death of the villagers and burning of the entire village. But the more far-reaching consequences were what I found more puzzling and intriguing. How and why did this incident turn into a reason for the abolishment of the Kurdish emirs' hereditary privileges existing in Ottoman political system for over 3 centuries? Reading through the hundreds of documents on the ways in which this case was handled in Ottoman bureaucracy, I realized that underlying these discussions was a fierce negotiation over the economic, political, and military privileges of the Palu elites, both in the locality and at the Ottoman Imperial Center. For the Beys, these privileges were legitimate hereditary rights bestowed upon them by Sultan Selim I back in the 16th century, by virtue of their noble position. From the perspective of the Ottoman state, however, these hereditary claims were not valid anymore. They were a remnant of the past. So from these discussions, one thing came across clearly. Palu Beys held a strong identity as a noble family who felt entitled to privileges tied to their noble position. And I'm going to switch back and forth between more recent periods and what happened back in the 19th century, because I conducted a fieldwork and oral history interviews in the area in 2013. And on a hot summer day in 2013, I visited Palu. I was in search of descendants of the Palu Beys. I really didn't know anything if they survived or not, if there were any descendants that would acknowledge that identity. My initial inquiry led me to this young man. I met with him at a gas station by the major highway connecting Palu with a central district of Kovancılar. During our meeting, he pointed with his finger out of the window to distance and said that he owned the quarry by the hill. His voice could not really hide his conceit. Dressed in a suit, throughout the talk, he made occasional references to his wealth, which I have to admit that I found a little bit interesting. He sounded proud to come from the Beys lineage, or so he said. In about 3 hours, I met with a real descendant of the Beys. That was when I discovered that this young man had totally fabricated the story. The actual descendant of the Beys, a retired teacher in his mid-50s, came to meet with me in his decrepit Renault 12, which I'm very familiar with because we had one of those, probably from the early 1990s. He seemed to be very happy to have received the attention of a long-expected historian, interested in his ancestors. He mentioned in our conversation that this quarry guy was a Nuerich who crafted a noble past for himself. He found it in the Palu Beys. In Palu, a small district, which is now an impoverished backwater, the title of Bey survived through the 21st century, but the wealth, not so much. This I found again puzzling, the persistence of this title, even though its bearers had long fallen from grace more than a century ago. Not only the descendants still had a consciousness of a noble pedigree that this title represented, but others who wanted to crown their wealth with a noble past also claimed it. And the significant thing is that the Palu Beys' real descendants were able to prove that noble identity of their ancestors with a temlikname, a title deed that's granted to them by the Ottoman sultans, recognizing their hereditary rulership over the Palu Emirate, which they still held in a chest in their attic. Down the road, I'm gonna show you a photo of that temlikname. So the noble identity of the family is explicit. If you noticed, I have been talking about a noble family, noble identity, noble past. But there is one thing, the idea that there was not hereditary nobility in the Ottoman Empire constitutes a foundational assumption in Ottoman historical writing. According to this widely accepted view, the Ottoman state diverged from its European counterparts in terms of its persistent opposition to hereditary rights and privileges. This perspective is supported by referring to the existence of 3 institutions, which are the building blocks of Ottoman classical regime. And you see these 3 points on the screen. Namely, the gradual Ottomanization of ruling aristocracies in the newly conquered areas, the devşirme system, the child levy system, and müsaadere, the confiscation of wealth. All 3 things actually refer to one point, that Ottoman state gradually Ottomanized local aristocracies as they conquered new territories. And it was essentially based on a meritocratic system, devşirme, and which didn't leave any room for hereditary noble titles. And the confiscation, or the müsaadere, the state's confiscation of wealth and property of the deposed elites. This was also interpreted as another indication of the Ottoman state's intolerance towards elite groups accumulating hereditary positions and wealth in Ottoman system. This is right, these are surely fundamental components of elite formation in the Ottoman system. But while drawing a clear line between European nobilities and Ottoman elites, historians who are more nuanced in their approach also point out exceptions, referring specifically to local dynasties in specifically remote provinces, including Crimea, Bosnia, or Hejaz, where these ruling families maintained their hereditary position within the Ottoman realm. So having read everything about my base, Palu Beys, noticing noble identity and its legal position in the Ottoman system, I asked this question: if there are all these exceptions in different parts of the empire, On what conceptual and historical assumptions is the consensus about the Ottoman state's uncompromising attitude towards hereditary nobility in Ottoman historiography is built? So, in its essence, this argument is based on the belief that there was only one type of nobility in Europe, and uniform across time and space with no historical variations. And more often than not, for Ottoman historians, the French nobility is the prototype of European nobility overall. In fact, the comparative studies of nobility at large are mostly defined by a research agenda derived from French history. Based in an entrenched estate system and constituting a corporate body, and with hereditary rights that could not be seized by the monarch, the French model was considered as the ideal type to compare and make conclusions about the Ottoman case. The reality, however, is that nobility in Europe was more heterogeneous than that. Contrary to the French case, not all noble groups were defined in strict legal terms as an estate by the monarch. Nobility had regional variations, urban-rural divisions, power and wealth differentials, variations in manners and etiquette. And all of these things make it impossible to discuss nobility as a uniform category. Nor was the nobility's political power consistent across place and time. Nobility having representation in a representative body certainly does not apply to all cases in or outside of Europe. So we know that Ottoman political formation is characterized by the diversity of the administrative arrangements through which different elite groups were incorporated into the Ottoman system. And there is excellent research, recent studies in Ottoman historiography that show this flexibility of incorporation of different elite groups. Geostrategic location, local socioeconomic characteristics, and the existing power configuration in a newly conquered area determined its administrative position in the Ottoman realm. In the areas where the classical military and fiscal regimes were not implemented, the local elites were incorporated into the Ottoman imperial realm through administrative arrangements that accorded them varying degrees of hereditary autonomous rule. So Kurdistan, my research specialty, was one of these areas where the special arrangements between the Kurdish ruling households and the Ottoman Sultan back in the 16th century was based on a similar arrangement on the recognition of these families' hereditary control over their dominions in the Ottoman realm. By focusing on the polyemirate, I take one of these cases, defined always as an exception outside of these brackets, and examine how a noble group with hereditary control over its wealth and position was made and unmade in the Ottoman Empire. But to understand this, we need to go back to the first encounter between the Kurdish elites and the Ottoman state. And this first encounter between the local Kurdish rulers and the Ottoman imperial state took place within the context of the imperial rivalry with the Safavid Empire, the ruling dynasty of what is today Iran, back in the 16th century. And this map shows the area where this territorial rivalry took place, which actually mostly constitutes what is Kurdistan at the time, and inhabited by Kurdish principalities. This first encounter shaped the Kurdish-based military, fiscal, and administrative prerogatives in Ottoman politico-administrative system. The Ottoman strategy of territorial expansion had never been based solely on force and military tools. Instead, a key element was negotiation with local power holders, to whom the Ottomans offered concessions and administrative flexibility in exchange for loyalty, because it's an empire. During his Eastern campaign, Sultan Selim I pursued this strategy with the Kurdish ruling elites of the area. After Chaldiran battle in 1514, Idrisi Bitlisi, a seasoned scribe in Ottoman court, was tasked with persuading the Kurdish emirs to side with the Ottomans against the Safavids. Meanwhile, the Kurdish beys were not passive. They wanted to use Idrisi Bitlisi also. His Kurdish origins and his familiarity with the sociopolitical realities of Kurdistan likely afforded him a degree of prestige and authority from the Kurdish point of view. as well as giving him legitimacy when he represented them to the Ottoman Sultan. Idris Bitlisi's ambassadorial skills proved critical in this regard. He was not only familiar with the region, but most likely also witnessed the Kurdish leaders' negotiation tactics with the Akkoyunlu and Karakoyunlu rulers during his previous tenure at the Akkoyunlu court. He also understood the socio-political organization of Kurdish leadership and the way their noble lineage allowed them to claim the right to rule over these territories. In his negotiations, Idris Bitlisi highlighted the Kurdish leaders' hereditary claims to rule and addressed them with the titles that indicated the noble pedigree, such as Bey, Beg, or Emir, Mir. His deep familiarity with Kurdistan and its noble families convinced him that recognizing the Kurdish Bey's hereditary claims to leadership was essential to securing their loyalty. In the administrative model that emerged after the Kurdish Beys accepted Ottoman suzerainty, the recognition of the Kurdish ruling house's hereditary privileges was an essential parameter. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this notion of privilege, because privilege stands at the core of the notion of nobility. So previously, I mentioned that nobility is an elite that is open, imperfectly defined, and subject to regional variation. And then you might ask, okay, what makes a group, an elite group, a noble group? And that would be a legitimate question. Even with these variations, the existence of certain patterns makes it worthwhile to deploy this concept to understand certain elite groups and their characteristics. Originating in a pre-capitalist socioeconomic milieu, nobility at its most basic entails an entitlement or preemptive claim on resources by virtue of one's own distinguished position. This notion of distinctiveness that nobility entails goes beyond just inequality, mere inequality with its dominantly legal and socioeconomic connotations. Furthermore, it's based on a dual acknowledgement. This is really important, externally by others and internally by the group that regards itself as noble. Noble privilege refers to the rights granted to a specific group based on hereditary descent from a venerable ancestor. According to one historian, privilege is European nobility's only indispensable characteristic. Through their wealth, political power, degree of authority, although all these things varied according to region and context, there was no such thing as nobles without privilege. And these privileges can be political, juridical, fiscal, and in social realms, and they can come in the form of positive, prerogatives, or negative as exemptions. So due to the permutation of prerogatives and exemptions in various realms, noble privilege, like nobility itself, is a historically and contextually defined phenomenon. What then did noble privilege entail, you might ask, again legitimately, in the case of Kurdish Beys, and more specifically the Beys of Palo, which they are at the center of my study? How were their rights, exceptions, and prerogatives defined? The answers to these questions will help us conceptualize noble privilege in the Ottoman context, where the mere fact of nobility with hereditary rights is a surprise. The construction of noble privilege for the Kurdish Beys began during this first encounter I just mentioned with Idris Bitlisi, the Ottoman ambassador dispatched to negotiate with them and enlist them as allies. But he did not start from scratch. Idris Bitlisi built on the region's existing ruling practices to define the legitimacy of the Beys and the rights and responsibilities conferred by their titles. Bitlisi started from the conviction that Kurdish Beys had a legitimate right to rule over their territories, a rule accepted by the region's previous ruling dynasties, ranging from Selçukis to Timur. So the noble privileges of the Kurdish Beys granted to them within a special administrative position as hükümet. It literally translates as government. What separated the hükümet from ordinary Ottoman sanjaks was that they were designated as Mefruzul Kalem and Maktul Kadem in the administrative system. The former referred to the hükümet's immunity from having tamars or fiefs granted to cavalrymen by the state in return for military service. This is the backbone of Ottoman military fiscal organization. This also meant that Mefruzul Kalem, that Palu, along with other Kurdish hükümets, were spared from tahrirs. These are periodical surveys conducted by the Ottoman state in the newly conquered territories to figure out what the resources, what the tax-bringing resources are. Once a new region was annexed, these detailed surveys were conducted and the data was recorded in detailed registers. And so the tahrir was not conducted in the Kurdish hükümet. Whereas the latter, the Maktul Kadem, meant that the Ottoman administrators, military or civilian, were prohibited from having any authority in the emirate, mainly the tax collectors, but also Janissary Corps troops as well. The beys held their own private forces and also seized the agrarian surplus from the areas under their domination. Thusly defined with these two designations, hükümets were accorded administrative and fiscal autonomy within the Ottoman system, and the noble families maintained them in a hereditary fashion. The earliest written documents establishing the Palu beys as a privileged nobility in the Ottoman realm is from 1835, granted during the reign of Sultan Süleyman the Lawgiver, Sultan Selim I's son. And I'm thankful to the descendants of the Palu beys because they, for the first time, shared this temlikname with me. And I was very excited when I saw that. It's hard to believe, but it's almost like 5 feet long document. It's just like one piece of this very long document. The document is a temlikname, or the title deed granted to Cemşit Bey by the Sultan during his Eastern campaign. So you might be asking who Cemşit Bey is. Cemşit Bey was to the Palu nobility what Osman Gazi was to Ottomans. He was the founding figure of the Palu Emirate within the Ottoman realm, but history of his noble family, the Mirdasi Begs, predated the Ottoman rule in the area. After his uncle died without an heir, Cemşit Bey became the leader of the Emirate and brought it under Ottoman rule. He is the ancestor of Abdullah Bey, who destroyed the Western village in 1848 in the vignette that I shared initially. The temlikname. So now I would like to talk a little bit more about this notion of privilege and how it was defined in this early document in the 16th century. The temlikname begins with an account of the context in which these rights were given. That is, Cemşit Bey and his armed troops helped Ottoman efforts against the Safavids. But, and then it also mentions that begs of Kurdistan altogether helped the Ottoman war effort. That's the introduction. But despite the top-down implications of the word privilege, the privileges decreed by the Sultan reflected the imperial state's recognition and acceptance of the beys' existing authority over these territories. The document is quite explicit about this. Quote, the aforementioned beys of Kurdistan had held and possessed these territories and the castles from the times immemorial, which had been their yurts and ocaks, unquote, meaning family estates. The temlikname further stated that the Kurdistan beys' castles and territories that they inherited from their ancestors, leaving it in their control. In the temlikname, the bearers of the privilege of hereditary rule were defined as the beys of Kurdistan, indicating the imperial state's perception of them as a collective entity. Another indication of this comes through the way the question of appointment is discussed in the temlikname. The document explicitly states that the hereditary character of the rulership and says in the absence of a legitimate heir, that is a male descendant, the new ruler would be chosen by the consultation and consensus of all of the Kurdistan beys. Thus, the Ottoman state not only acknowledged the Kurdish beys as a corporate group entitled to specific immunities and prerogatives, but it also accepted their authority to decide on the ruler through their collective decision-making processes and established that the Ottoman state would not bring in someone from outside of that collective. While it laid out the privileges of all the beys of Kurdistan, The temlikname was specifically granted to Cemşit Bey, the Hakim of Palu. The castles, towns, and fields, and then their yields were granted to him and his heirs as their private property. In my overall larger research, I focus specifically on land ownership and show how land ownership, like privileges related to land ownership, changed over time. What makes these privileges the building block of a particular noble group is not the specific rights and exemptions, but that they were hereditary, bestowed by the Sultan through legal means. The contract required continuity from both ends. The imperial state wanted to maintain the loyalty of the Kurdish base after the current Sultan's reign ended. This concern is evident in the temlikname. And it is, I think, as far as I have seen another example, it's one of the rare cases where there is like a prospective reference. I'm quoting now, "It is my vasiyet or will and order to my children who are worthy of happiness that my blessed decree not be altered or amended after me, and they will obey my existing orders on this matter," Sultan says, unquote. Likewise, the beys were asked to submit to the rule of the Sultan's heirs and not support any potential external threats. While the de jure acceptance of the hereditary rights of the Palu beys remained intact from the time until the mid-19th century, this striking continuity should not be misunderstood as meaning that the relationship between the beys and the imperial state was static. It shifted continually according to changing military and fiscal exigencies and the unrelenting negotiation between the parties. It was a long power dynamic. It was like a long, interesting dance that I observed from the 16th century up until the end of the 19th century. So, and I said that this nobility, to be a nobility, you have to be defined both ways, right? And I mentioned the notion of privilege, but that there are other signs of nobility. The making of the nobility also involved a process of ideological construction that allowed them to justify their status and wealth by virtue of descent from noble ancestors. This construction was fortified through a special code of conduct used only with other nobility and the ruler, by the concept of honor, and by using honorific titles to differentiate them from others. Honorific titles are a key symbolic component in the ideological underpinnings of nobility. In the case of the Kurdish noble families, titles varied over time and included terms such as pir, bey, emir, or mir. But in Ottoman imperial correspondence, they refer to the Palu elites or hakims with bey. They use the bey title specifically. You might think that, well, it's a common usage in Ottoman bureaucratic language. Bey is a common title, except the fact that in the hundreds of documents that I read about the Kurdish elites, Ottoman administrators never used bey to refer to the tribal chiefs. They carefully separated them, and whenever they used the bey title, it was almost always, it came with a reference to their historic land over, historic rule over the Palu land. And another indicator of nobility. To speak of nobility, Mark Bloch wrote, is to speak of pedigrees. The way to justify hereditary rights over landed wealth in times of economic distress or to protect existing fiscal or political privileges vis-a-vis potentially hostile monarchs, it was often through genealogy. The Palu beys had a consciousness of their noble identity and had a conspicuous interest in their pedigrees. In 1682, the then ruling Hakim of Palu, Yensur Bey, asked his scribe Şem'i to translate Şerefname into Ottoman from Persian. This is not what I'm showing you. I'm going to talk about this document in a minute. I think I was a little bit early. Şerefname was a history of the Kurdish dynasties and ruling houses completed in 1597. Şeref Han himself was also a Kurdish noble, one of the beys of Bitlis Emirates in the second half of the 16th century. According to Şem'i, I really find this story fascinating. I try to visualize the setting and what they were talking about, but then I have quite a bit of information about the content. According to the translator Şem'i's account, the idea of translating this work into Ottoman came when the guests of Jan Survey, many of whom were also other Kurdish beys, began to talk about their ancestors and then their rule. As they shared what they knew about their noble past, they consulted Şerefname and realized that it was filled with information. Jan Survey then commissioned Şem'i to translate it into Ottoman. Jan Survey's patronage of the translation of Şerefname is an example of the Kurdish beys' interest in documenting the history of their noble ancestors. But what you are seeing here is one of the pedigrees that Palu Bey's descendants shared with me, a much more recent one. And they shared this one and a modern Turkish one with me. This is also, as you see, a very big document showing all the, and I actually detected a few mistakes in there in both of these documents, but I didn't share those with them. So, lastly, I want to point out one more thing, service. We talked about privilege, we talked about the signs of nobility, symbolic signs of nobility, but then there's also service. Nobilities are formed as a result of the coalescence of service with privilege. In return for certain services they perform and the duties they fulfill, nobilities are assigned rights, privileges, and prerogatives in a hereditary fashion. And in the case of the Palu Beys, the initial service was defined as military service, and Palu Beys all throughout the 16th and up until the mid-17th century, they served in the Ottoman, along with the Ottoman forces during their military campaigns in and around Iran. So if I had another hour, I would have shared with you how the notion of service changed. Military service then transforms into a different type of service in mines that Palu Beys became responsible for providing the needs of the surrounding mines in the area. But we don't have time for that. So I want to wrap up real quick to tell you why I find this story fascinating after working on it so many years, why I never get tired of this, because it is really important to understand the history of the Kurdish nobles to understand this hereditary notion. So the one point that I want to highlight is that the content of the notion of the privilege was contextual. So fiscal, military, and administrative prerogatives and exemptions of the Kurdish beys changed in relation to changing circumstances. But also, I think this entire story bring an alternative to nation-state-centered readings of Kurdish history and the history of the Kurdish elites. The hereditary privileges that the Kurdish beys maintained for 3 centuries tied them to the imperial state. It gave them their imperial identity. Even after the system wanted to really get rid of them, they really dearly hold on to these noble privileges given to them by the Ottoman Sultan and proven with these temliknames. So the noble identity of the Kurdish elites is not, or it was not something that separated them from the Ottoman state, but rather tied it to the state strongly. So as I mentioned, there are all these exceptions who, the emirates who led heroic uprisings against the Ottoman state's centralizing policies in the 19th century. But Palu Beys, it's not that story. It's a story of a noble elite trying to maintain their legitimacy, referring to the Ottoman state. And before the 19th century, Ottoman state also adhered to what was defined in these temliknames and respected them and didn't want to change them for over 3 centuries. The only time that they wanted to get rid of these hereditary privileges altogether was with the Tanzimat, and that constitutes as like the second or third aspect of my research, which I cannot share here right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Özok-Gündoğan. You've given us a lot to think about, both with respect to the specific area of your focus and also really raising issues that are central to how we kind of interpret the Ottoman Empire as a whole. So thank you. I'm giving folks a minute here to collect some questions. If you would please, if you have a question, if you're able, please use your reaction tools to raise your hand, and I'll acknowledge questions in order, or you can use the chat. Yes, Professor Minow, yes, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nilay. This is really, really interesting. But it stopped at exactly the moments in time when it hits a place that I'm familiar with, which is post-Tanzimat, late 19th century. And it brings up questions that I'm sure a lot of us are thinking about, which is that Polo, like a lot of the Eastern provinces, was not just Kurdish. They were the Kurdish, Armenian, and so on. And when you were saying that the Beys were finding a way to maintain, where did you go? I hate when those, okay, there you are. So on my screen, it's like a little boxes that move around, and I have to look at you when I'm asking the question. Anyway. No, it's not you, it's the system. So when the Beys are trying to hold on to their privilege or hold on to their nobility, even when the system has changed and the state no longer finds value in maintaining this kind of connection, you said that the Beys were very much trying to kind of maintain some kind of, so of course, immediately what comes to mind, late 19th century, is of course, how do you ingratiate yourself to, say, late 19th century Ottoman imperial state with the Armenian problem hanging out in the same region? Would you participate? Do you know how whether they participated? Not so much, I'm not talking about specifically in the massacres, but of course, all of these processes that eventually led to pushing out or pushing out the Armenian population or making the Armenian population weaker in a way that allowed for the intervention of the central state. Basically, the question is, how were they involved with the Armenian issue question after the like in the late 19th century? Thank you.
Thank you for this question, Mustafa. Yeah, in 1848, after what happened in Weshin, the state takes this drastic decision to confiscate the Beys property, right? The Beys lands. And you're right, this is a Kurdish, Armenian, and also Turkish area to a lesser extent. And after the Beys property was confiscated and opened up for sale, it was mostly Armenian financial bourgeoisie who purchased these lands. They had enough cash, and then they pushed for this decision. And then they were really influential in pushing the central state to take action. And after the land was like 1/3 of the Beys land was confiscated and opened up for sale, especially in the areas northern bank of Eastern Euphrates, in Armenian villages, predominantly Armenian villages, land ownership changed quite a bit. And then I documented to what extent it changed in my larger research. And from the 1840s through the rest of the 19th century, what we have on the scene is this really grave conflict between the Kurdish Beys, the Polo Beys, and the Armenians. But the Armenians are not also a monolithic group. So we have those who were able to purchase land, but then there are also others who are sharecroppers that till the lands of the Beys, but also new landowners who happen to be Armenians. And then even after the Beys lands were confiscated and purchased by majority Armenians, the lands, the relations of land, the relations of production in land still continue as it was before the confiscation. And then this context itself constitutes the underlying or the background to what happened in Polo in 1895. So 1895 massacres, we know it was like all around the empire, but everywhere there is a larger imperial and regional and international context to what happened in 1895, but in each place there is a local story going on. In Polo, it was like the base starting from 1890. Specifically, I can't put my finger on that date. From 1890, the Polo base tried to get these lands back. They tried to get these lands back, and then the struggle between the Armenian landowners and the Armenian villagers, sometimes they fight collectively, that fight really deepens. And from 1890 through 1895, there are two areas in which the Beys are trying to get their power back. One is the administrative organization. They want representation in the Ottoman provincial bureaucracy. And then the second thing is this land ownership business. And in this, like, and foreign observers also document that, like, by 1890, things change drastically, that the Beys are really increasing their efforts to get the land back. So what happens in Polo in 1895 is, it's like, what's the English name for that? It's like a revanche. It's a revanchist moment that they're trying to get those lands back, and the Armenians resist. And also, like, where of the Armenian villages where violence was really grave, where there is like the most losses, these are the villages where this land conflict with the Beys was going on for almost 30 years before 1895. So this today, I just focused on one component of this entire story related to these Beys, because I think this is the most recent component which really energizes me, and I really like talking about it. But I take this story and then demonstrate it mostly from the locals' point of view, the local struggles, because the nobility, negotiating nobility, that is happening in the locality, primarily happening in the locality. And in Polo, like events leading up to the 1895 massacres, it's all about negotiation over this privilege. What is gonna happen in this case, that they are claiming that they have legitimate right over these lands, referring to as ferman, etemlik, given by the Sultan himself. So thank you so much for this question. It gave me an opportunity to talk a little bit more about something that is really important in this entire narrative.
Thank you.
A question from Toygun.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. The Temlikname itself was also very interesting. I'm glad I got to see a document like that. My question is sort of related to Professor Minawi's, in that I'm also interested in the relationship between these Beys and the peasants on the land, right? You mentioned sharecropping as being, I'm assuming, the primary mode of the relationship between these lords and the peasants. But I'm also wondering what kind of privileges these lords had over peasants insofar as, let's say, corvée goes, or insofar as the collection of duties and taxes over occupied properties like mills or shops or buildings, etc. Because these, it seems to me that I'm looking at Dersim right now for this kind of similar relationship, and I'm seeing that also is a very important and early site of contestation between the residents of the land, whether they're Armenian or Kurdish, right? Essentially people who are not nobles, and the lords themselves. If I can ask a related question, so I'll ask a question and a half, I guess. That half question is, what kind of compensation do these lords receive for so I mean, their property is confiscated, right? But they're still recognized both locally and by imperial officials to an extent as remnants of this nobility. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering what whether it's unofficial privileges or actual cash payments, etc. What you see in Palu as compensation for them turning over their property. Thank you.
So thank you so much for this question, but I want to clarify, your question about compensation is after their lands were confiscated, right?
Yes, okay. That's
so the state initially wants to confiscate their entire property, but then the negotiation process forced them, because this base sends representatives to the center, Armenians also send representatives to the center, and then there is this really interesting, fierce struggle between them. And as a result, and this takes like several dozens of documents that, I mean, I want to refer to the length of negotiation itself. The state decides on this arrangement. the lands of Polo Base would be divided into three. So they're allowed to keep one piece in their hands. And then the remaining part is divided into two. One piece goes to non-Muslims. This is how they describe, Ottoman State uses religious designations. And then the other half goes to non-Muslims, Muslims and non-Muslims. So one piece still is left. So that's part of the compensation. But the second part of the compensation is that they are assigned as the müdür, which is a new thing, a new type of administrative position. They're appointed as müdürs with salaries. But the twist here is that salary was to be hereditary. So it is like an accommodation. It is a modern organization, but that salary is to be hereditary, is the remnant of that ancient organization or long-lived organization. As in terms of your first question, corvée is an because in Ottoman historical writing, that is the assumption, right? There is no corvée, the peasantry is totally free. We both know that it is not true. And particularly in Polu, corvée is a big problem. And that reflects on peasant petitions quite a bit. But the established legitimate, I want to say, like legitimate, but like accepted type of labor in the rural sector is sharecropping. And then sharecropping is based on a special arrangement. It is, I'm doing the math right now, 20% tithe, okay, 20% tithe, and 1/5 is 20%, right? Yes. And then they're sharing the half of the produce with the base. So it's quite grave exploitation in the agrarian sector. And at the core of the struggle in the agrarian sector is over this arrangement of sharecropping. And in the areas that I'm looking at, it's Palu's land is quite fertile, and that's why the state is interested in Palu in the 19th century. And what was I going to say? There is not, I haven't come across any cases where there are houses or mills where they are arguing over. The case is mostly about agrarian land. But then there are also cases in which it is beyond the agricultural production, but it's more of a symbolic and authority issue that the Armenian villagers, they don't want the base to reside in their villages. So in the 19th century, particularly Armenian accounts narrated quite a bit that they want to kick the base outside of their villages. But I don't think what is at stake there is a property issue. That is mostly an authority and hegemony discussion that is going on. But at the heart of the issue is an agrarian conflict. I hope that helps.
Nilay, a question came up in the chat about if you could speak a bit to how the events you describe actually might affect Kurdish identity today. So how some of the genealogies of privilege and kind of local specificities that you spoke about, are these relevant to Kurdish politics and in the present moment?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, this was like one of the original questions that I had in mind looking at the principalities or emirates, because this is what historiography does, right? They talk about the Kurdish principalities from a mostly presentist point of view, what they represent in terms of Kurdish statelessness right now, what do they represent in terms of all the trauma and violence that the Kurdish population has been going through in the Middle East. Since I'm an historian and I could be a little bit annoying about these things, I am a little iffy about this like linear narrative from the 1800s until the 20th century. There was a linear story of disintegration or decline or whatever. But in like the reality is that after the dissolution of the Kurdish emirates, both the small ones and the big ones, we see that Kurdish sociopolitical organization changes. Kurdish sociopolitical organization changes in ways that have a bearing on the trajectory of Kurdish nationalism in the 20th century. But what I want to emphasize is that there was no such Kurdish unity after the 16th century. After the 16th century, from the 17th through the 19th centuries, Kurdish emirates were quite disintegrated. They ceased to constitute a corporate body unlike what they used to be back in the 16th century. So yeah, I think that would be my answer. I can't give you an easy answer because I don't think that I can draw a strict linear line from the 19th century to the state. But I think the experience of the Palu base tell us more about the Kurdish situation in the 19th century than the big elites that I mentioned. Because I think the majority of the Kurdish emirs, their experience were like the Palu emirs in terms of they wanted to maintain their privileges, and the only condition for them to maintain their privileges was the continuation of the Ottoman household or Ottoman dynasty.
So I know that Nilay has very generously offered to stay on for a few more minutes and continue the discussion. I did just want to, since I know some people will have to sign off right around now, I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank you again so much for being with us and for sharing your research with us. But if you're able to continue the discussion, I think we have a few minutes that we could take one or two more questions. Naveen, is that right? Can we continue? Yes. Okay. Wonderful. I saw Omer's hands and David, and then Alan also has a question in the chat. So we'll try to maybe bring those together.
Would you like to? I mean, I don't know which.
Sure. I think Omer.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nilay, for your presentation. I'm going to play safe and also ask something that I am working on. Not very specific about Palu, but generally, I actually also work the transformation of the region, particularly from the political economic perspective. So if you look at these, the disappearance of the Emirates creates some sort of, hegemony gap within the region in the society. Have you actually noticed which internal actors particularly replace Emirates after their disappearance within the society? How these new structure impacts social structure, cultural structure of the region, of the society? And also, have you also noticed, do you see any new class and agent emerging within the Kurdish society during that time? And also, lastly, how this impacts the economy of the region? Do you think involvement of the center, Istanbul, became more case after the disappearance of Emre? Thank you very much, and sorry for being long.
Oh, thank you, Omar, and it's really nice to see you. So in Kurdish historical writing, there is this established model. The model is based on this. Kurdish Emirates, they came under Ottoman rule in the 16th century, and in the 19th century, disintegration. But in between, we don't know what happens. And after the 19th century, there is also another shortcut historical account, which argues that the base disappeared almost overnight, Emirates disappeared almost overnight, and religious sheikhs or religious authorities filled in this power vacuum that emerged after the base disappearance. I also noticed that in Palu, from the 1840s onwards, religious authorities, there's like a budding religious sheikh authority in Palu, just like in many other places in Kurdistan. But that transition is more smooth and more conflicted than a linear takeover from base to the religious authorities. And I emphasize this in almost every talk because it's really important to me. Even though Kurdistan in our hearts and minds constitute an whole as a political unit, in terms of its socioeconomic and especially socioeconomic organization, there is a lot of diversity. And then we have to look closely to understand what type of power configuration and the transformation of power configuration happens in different parts of Kurdistan. So in Palu, yes, there is the Naqshbandi order, the rising Naqshbandi order in Palu from the 1840s onwards. But it's not until the early 20th century that they become an important political actor in the area. And then the historical narrative that I just had issues with, that I just mentioned, it also portrays the Kurdish politics in the aftermath of the dissolution of the Emirates as a non-political context. So the Kurdish elites are devoid of entire political agency, and then they disappear like this because their lands are confiscated. No, they persevere, they struggle, and then they don't lose their leadership positions overnight. So yes, there is like up and coming religious authority, but at the same time, it is more gradual, but also more conflicted within the case of Palu. But I want to be really cautious because I can't speak to the entire Kurdistan. There is so many regional varieties. And in terms of class, well, if it wasn't for 1895, I could have talked about, I mean, let me put it this way. From 1840s through the early 20th century, or maybe until the genocide, in Palu, there is an explicit emergence of an Armenian financial class. Okay, and so their transformation is intrinsically tied to the fate of the Kurdish emirs, because, well, I shed light on a conflictual moment, but before Ottoman engagement, before the Ottomans confiscated their lands, they worked together. Armenian financial bourgeoisie, they were the sarrafs for the tax farmer elites, tax farmer Kurdish base. So that symbiotic relationship becomes more, controversial in the second half of the 19th century, but then they are still there. So to sum up, I think I feel like I'm being vague, but I want to say a few words about the approach. Politics is going on. I am very critical of this approach, which tells like a linear story of disappearance, as if Kurdish political agency disappeared overnight. Not really. But I also want to emphasize it's like the political economy of that transformation is quite critical. Class relations, like changing land ownership patterns. So, Ömer, I hope this answers. If not, I would have to have a Zoom coffee hour with you. We can talk more about this and your new book.
Thank you.
Nilay, there was a very specific question that came up in the chat from Nalan as to whether this title of Bey, have you ever seen it applied specifically to nomadic Kurdish tribal figures?
Not in Palu, Nalan. This is a very interesting question, and I didn't know that there is this personal connection. I would love to hear more about that. Never. It's because like tribal chiefs are rendered almost always nameless in Ottoman conversation. They are described as tribal chiefs like Ağas. So in Ottoman administrative parlance, Ağas are mostly anonymous, but Beys are always specified referring to their first name.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think David might have the last question then.
All right, Nilay, thanks so much. This was fascinating. I love the talk, and I promise I'm not going to ask a 19th century question, even though, of course, it would be in my it'd be my instinct to do so. And I've loved the questions and your responses to them. But I actually have a question about the pre-19th century period, and really actually a historiographical one. And that is, to what extent do you think, at least at this point, do you think your findings will force us to rethink our idea of this sort of classical Ottoman period, or this sort of move from prebendal Timars to Iltizam and Malikane, this sort of classical idea we have of Ottoman political economy? To what extent do we look at the Kurdish regions as not an exception, but rather as upending this view of this Ottoman system? And if you could also maybe talk a little bit more about this comparative aspect also, which I think is quite fascinating, quite interesting. I mean, yeah, awesome.
David, I missed the last part of your question about the comparative aspect.
Sorry, the comparative. So you had mentioned how you had mentioned how there's certain ideal type, the French ideal type that you mentioned early in the talk, but yet at the same time you seem to be suggesting that part of the problem of looking at this sort of Ottoman classical period and classical political economy is that it makes the Ottomans seem exceptional in a way that perhaps prevents comparison. So that's what I meant, is that to address that comparison.
Yes, thank you, David. About the first part of your question, like what does it tell us about the Ottoman system? So I don't want to be anecdotal, but this is, I thought a lot about this. In the 18th century, the developments that scholars like Dina Huri or Arya Salzman, they talk about the Malikanization, right? Malikanization in especially like the Arab provinces, but also partly places like provincial centers like Diyarbakir. There is no such thing as like that in Palu. But that's interesting because like by the 18th century, that initial contract is about 2 centuries old, but it is still valid, it is still relevant. And the Ottoman state, interestingly, or like the state elites at large, they're not trying to, they're still trying to do inroads into Palu's financial sector, but they're not forcing it that much. So there is this ongoing acceptance of the relevance of that agreement made back in the 16th century. So yes, if we think of it as from a quantitative point of view, yes, Palu is an exception because there is only a few places in the area where there is such an established system of hereditary privilege. But at the same time, it makes us really reconsider this idea of strong Ottoman state. It is it's categorically rejecting hereditary privileges. It's not as it is trying to change everything. And nowadays we always talk about Ottoman state dynamism, right? Which is really important because we had to deal with this Orientalist and decline theory narratives for such a long time. But what I see here is Ottoman state, even though it's changing a lot, it also has this notion of tradition, which gives them legitimacy, referring back to these imperial decrees. So it's not, what I'm saying is not that, yeah, we should see the Ottoman state as a conservative state going back to the old school, but not really. So they really adhere to this long-lived agreements made back in the 16th century. Are they trying to force it? Definitely. They are trying to conduct tahrirs. They are trying to push Tamars into the region. But at the same time, they never question that established notion of privilege. So I know we have to end. I don't want to take so much time. And about the comparative aspect, yes, because for a long time, I had difficulty like wrapping this thing around my head. Like, these guys look like nobles to me. Why should I argue that they are not nobles? They have hereditary privileges. So after reading like examples from different examples from Russian aristocracy to Mexican aristocracies, different Eastern Europe and Western Europe, I realized that that notion of nobility that we refer to in Ottoman historical writing is a very outdated conceptualization of nobility. Just like feudalism, which came to be revised, seeing nobility as an historical category, as opposed to an ideal type, helped me a lot to situate it within the Ottoman historical context. But also from a European historical perspective, there is like an ongoing Orientalist perspective. I have read tons of edited volumes on European nobilities. There is only one reference to the Ottoman state, and in that case, it is mentioned as notables as opposed to nobility. I'm not kidding. It's an edited volume on the nobilities, by the way. So again, there is this idea of like uniqueness of Ottoman state. It's an exception. It doesn't fit with the larger picture, is dominant in European historiography as well.
May I have a last question?
It's up to Nilay, if you have the time to
Yeah, I would be happy.
It's so nice to have people from around the country and from Turkey. We could probably turn this into a seminar and keep going for another hour, but it would be lovely. Please, Shaheen, why don't you take it?
Yeah. Thank you very much for your presentation. I just wonder about how the Ottoman state legitimized the confiscation of this yurtluk and ocakluk system, and is there any relationship between the new regulations of the Tanzimat state, like the land code or the tapu law, and the legitimization of this confiscation? And you also talk about that the lands of this nobility, it's sold and it was auctioned open to the public. So I'm wondering about this land conflict. how this land conflict is resolved. Was there any special commission for this case? Because I'm also working on what happened to another land question in another part of the Republic. So just for comparison, I wonder whether there was a special commission to solve this conflict, also the confiscation, and what will happen to the lands after the confiscation. Thank you,
Nilay Hocam, for the question. Yes, well, the interesting thing is that like their lands were confiscated in 1840, from 1850, I want to say. And, you know, land code is in 8 years, but there is also previous regulations in 1840, 1841. I find it quite curious that the entire period, I read everything about Polu that is based in the Ottoman archives. There's not any single reference to the land code in documents related to Polu. And I think, I mean, I was being cautious with this argument, but I think even though land is confiscated, that in the minds of the Ottoman administrators, that Mefruzul Kalem status is still very much alive. So there is not, like, everything in relation to the land regulations on this district, there is no reference to larger Ottoman land legislation as they go about resolving these disputes. And sorry, I forgot the first part of your question. Yeah, they confiscated that. How do they justify it? Yeah, this is a very interesting point, because how they justify it is they make this point. We gave these privileges to these beys during Hizamati Jihadiye, during because of their service in Holy War back in the reign of the previous sultans, but it's over now because we have a regular army. So we don't need their service anymore, so we have to take away these privileges. So this is the ideological justification, but of course, if we look more closely into its political economy, Polu is specifically important because of its agrarian capacity. So they focus specifically on Polu because of its fertile lands. So yes, there is an ideological justification background, but there's a political economy of that. Why Polu? Polu is such an insignificant place in the grand scheme of things, right? But then they emphasize, if we take these lands away, tithe revenues will increase threefold. So there is like ongoing conversation about that. There is no commission, but there is always an inspector that is being sent. There is an inspector that goes, or surveyor, depending on the context, and they create these reports about the double taxation, illegal taxation, to what extent land were sold. And those reports are really important for me because we always think of Armenian experience as one of dispossession in the region. But when I read through these reports, what I see is that they talk about like getting back their lands, or they talk about how they paid more than the value of land. And then I realized that they actually purchased a lot of lands in this process. I mean, I can't describe I can't give you actual numbers, but what I see is that, yes, there is an emerging Armenian landowner group after the land confiscation, but that's short-lived, of course. That's short-lived, and then in the background of the ethnic conflict is this changing wealth and land ownership in the region.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Nilay, and thank you everyone for joining us. It's really a pleasure, and thank you for being so generous with your time. It's a pleasure to learn about this research. I know I'm definitely going to be following up with you by email with my own specific questions. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for these wonderful questions, and I am happy to share this component of the research with you. Thank you all, and thanks very much,
Nilay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, too. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Great to see everyone.
Galaxy Pass, çok teşekkürler.
Thank you.